The UFC has a massive problem right now where a lot of their champions just don't want to fight. Let's get into it. I was scrolling on my Twitter feed today and I saw a video of Khamzat Chimaev talking in an interview about how much money he makes outside of the octagon as well as his inactivity, and as annoying as his comments are here, I fully understand it.
I know a lot of people always sees you and talk about you that, oh, he doesn't fight so often, he fights too rarely, he's not that active.
I don't care. I'm making millions. That people just talking and doing nothing. I make more money like out of the UFC where I'm becoming, like Khamzat, wherever I go, they want to sponsor, they want to do different things with me and all business and this and that.
So this interview is actually what prompted me to make this video because I think there's some underlying patterns that no one's really talking about here. Chimaev is essentially saying that he makes enough money outside of the octagon to the point that he doesn't need to be active in the UFC anymore. And I think that just completely sums up where the UFC as a company is at the moment, because we are literally at a point where the champions of this company no longer need to actively fight because they are making more money outside of fighting. Which brings me into my first theme: where are the champions? I've got a legitimate question for everyone watching this video. Where are all of the champions in 2026? We arguably have some of the most skilled and dominant champions currently ruling their divisions, but we just haven't seen them defend their titles since last year. We are already 4 months into 2026 and we haven't seen any of them. Why is it that we've had only one real title defense in the first quarter of this year? If you don't know what I'm talking about, let me lay it out like this, man. We've already had 3 numbered events this year and we have a 4th one coming up this weekend, but like I said, we've only had one actual legitimate title defense so far. UFC 324 in January was an interim title fight headlining that event. UFC 325, that's the only legitimate title defense we've had, and it was a Volk versus Diego Lopez rematch. UFC 326 was a BMF title fight, which, listen, as exciting as the BMF title is, it doesn't count, and also this fight was not exciting at all. And now UFC 327, the fight headlining this card, is an interim title fight. And listen, man, I know we lost a flyweight title fight because Joshua Van got injured, but still, in 4 months of 2026, we've only had one actual title defense. And this title defense came from one of the oldest champions that we currently have, Alexander Volkanovski. And listen, I'm not going to dog on UFC 327 too hard, but the fact that Paulo Costa is the co-main event of this card, like, did they genuinely not have anything better that they could have just slapped onto this? Interim titles are a massive problem in the UFC and they are only just going to keep pushing for more interim titles as time goes on, which brings me into my next theme: the interim belt era. Listen, man, I made an entire video on this a couple months ago at the start of this year talking about how this year the UFC is going to heavily push into getting more interim belts. And the reason for this is because a lot of their champions just don't want to be active because the UFC do not want to pay them what they deserve. So what's the alternative? The UFC will create a bunch of fake belts where they can lowball contenders into taking this interim title fight because they don't have any choice. We saw it with Diego Lopez. The reason they offered him the fight is because he knew he didn't deserve it, so they could realistically offer him a low amount and he would accept because he knew it was the only opportunity he was going to get. That's why the UFC always steers clear of naming a fight a #1 contender fight, because then that contender has actual leverage to negotiate higher pay. And like I said, man, we've already got 2 interim title fights booked for this year. If you just look at the White House card, we've got Alex Pereira versus Cyril Gane. Exciting fight, but again, man, this could have just been Alex Pereira versus John Jones without a title attached to it, but the UFC just didn't want to pay. I guarantee you, like I said in my prediction video earlier this year, we're going to see at least 4 interim titles this year. It's just a way for them to replace inactive champs, lowball contenders, and also just fill the gaps for these cards that don't have a champion already on it. But I just feel like this creates a bigger issue because then you've got 2 champions in a division and the actual champion with the real belt like Ilia Topuria hasn't even had a title defense yet, but there's already an interim champion in that same division. It just creates a big cluster that no one wants. Which brings me into my next theme, the White House card. Listen, man, a lot of us were just making excuses for the UFC these past couple of months where we weren't getting these champions defending their belts, and we were hoping that the UFC was saving these champions for the White House card. There were a lot of promises that there'd be at least 3 to 4 titles title defenses on this White House card, so we were kind of happy to have slop for the first 3 to 4 months of this year. But now that this White House card is revealed, it's like, genuinely, where are the champions? It kind of made sense thinking that the UFC was saving them for this card, but when you look at this White House card, we've only got one actual title defense on this card, and then, like I said before, an interim title fight. And then again, even the headliner of this White House card, it's the actual champion versus the interim champion. So it's like, bro, where are all the other champions on the biggest stage, the biggest card that they have ever had in the history of the sport? They couldn't just like fork up a bit more money to pay these champions to get an Islam Makhachev versus Topuria fight. I just don't understand it, man. Which brings me into my next theme, the incentive problem. Going back to what I said at the start of this video with Khamzat Chimaev, what he said in this interview speaks volumes to how most of these other champions feel. The fighters just aren't getting paid what they deserve. Not that they aren't getting paid enough, because no doubt people like Khamzat Chimaev, Islam Makhachev, they are earning a decent paycheck, but for the amount of numbers and revenue that they bring into the company each event that they are on, I think we can all agree that they just aren't getting paid what they would get paid elsewhere. And it's creating a big issue, because now we've got these big companies that are willing to sponsor these high profile athletes for a lot more money than they are most likely making to fight. Not to mention, when you think about fighting and how much of a high risk sport it is, if an athlete got into this sport for the money, but now they are making more money outside of the sport and they also don't have to put their lives on the line, I fully understand why they would just choose to not be active and be like Chimaev, be like Makhachev, and just fight once a year when you actually have to. Because when you look at it, a lot of these guys were so active on the regional scenes. Even when they first joined the UFC, they were fighting 3, 4, 5 times a year. Khamzat Chimaev, I think, fought back-to-back weekends, because it's clear all of these guys get in it initially for the money. So when you really put yourself in their shoes, it fully makes sense like why you just wouldn't be active at this level when you know how big of a name you are, you know how much revenue you're bringing in and how much you're realistically making back. I don't know, man. Risk versus reward. Which brings me into my next theme, Ilia Topuria. Ilia Topuria is a great example of everything I've just spoke about, because he's one of those athletes that is kind of starting to transcend the sport a little bit. We saw it with Conor McGregor. Now, I'm not saying that both of these guys are anywhere near on the same level. Conor McGregor is just in a different stratosphere of stardom, but Ilia Topuria is starting to emerge as a name outside of the sport itself. He recently signed a big deal with Richard Mille, which is a massive watch company, and this is a massive deal for all athletes, because no doubt he made a massive paycheck off of this sponsorship. Even guys like Islam and Khamzat both have global sponsorships, because their reach now goes beyond the UFC and the country they're from. So we're now at a point where these champions have built a big enough name to the point where they don't need to fight as often, and for them it's just a case of holding the belt and maintaining that status will get them bigger sponsorships and brand deals. Which brings me into my next theme, holding the belt hostage. Like I said, a lot of these champions are now following the blueprint of Jon Jones. If you guys remember, after Jon Jones beat Stipe, there was a lot of talk of him fighting Tom Aspinall, which I never really believed, because we just knew he wouldn't take that risk. But what Jon Jones did was kind of the smart play if you really think about it from a business perspective. From a fan perspective, I absolutely hate Jon Jones, but from a business perspective, it makes sense. He essentially held onto the belt for a year after beating Stipe, not denying that he was going to fight Tom Aspinall, but also not overly committing to the fight. And what this allowed him to do was build enough hype from people thinking he was going to return and fight Aspinall. So naturally, there were so many companies coming in wanting to sponsor him, give him opportunities to be a coach on all of these random shows, pay him a massive paycheck because he has the status of an undisputed heavyweight champion that could potentially be having a big fight coming up. So all these companies are looking at it from the perspective of, if I sponsor this guy, it's going to be a return investment once he fights next. Where, like I said, he never intended on fighting Tom Aspinall, but just carrying that title and that illusion alone allowed him to become an asset bigger than the sport itself. And like I said, now we're seeing it with guys like Ilia Topuria, Islam Makhachev, Chimaev. All these guys fight once a year, but you see them announcing more sponsorships on their social media than they do fights. Which brings me into my next theme, the real problem. Listen, as an MMA fan, you can have two types of champions, but really it's a double-edged sword. You can have champions like Marab, Bilal Muhammad, Pantoja, all these guys that are highly skilled but don't have flashy personalities outside of the sport, and also just aren't really a big name. So fighting is their main source of income, hence they are going to be extremely active. That's why we saw Marab Merab defend his title like 4 times in 1 year, because that's the only real source of his income. But the downside of that is there's not as much hype, there's not as much build up for the fans. But then you've got champions like Ilia, Topuria, Islam Makhachev, where they have bigger names and known outside of the sport now. So naturally, any fight that they are involved in, you are 100% going to watch with more investment, but they fight a lot less because they just don't need to anymore. The UFC system now almost rewards inactivity, and I think the company itself probably prefers their champions to be a bit more inactive, hence they don't have to pay as much, and now they can just boost up interim title fights, and they can almost have double the amount of champions while maintaining the stars that they already currently have. I don't know, man, I just miss the days of Volk, Izzy, Kamaru Usman, all these guys being active champions, still having a relatively big name, because now we just get one or the other. And it almost just feels like the belt is starting to lose meaning the more interim title fights we do, and the less active that the champions are. But those are my thoughts, man. Let me know what you guys think. Make sure you guys do drop a like in this video, and make sure to subscribe as well, man. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Boos.
I want to oil you up. What the f does that mean?